So, Amy, would you take this time to share with us something about this book?
Hello, Eden. It is so good to be home. I understand. It is a challenging time to do the work of ministry. I'm mindful that we gather here today from various places of hurting and hoping. I hope that you will take what is helpful from what I have to share and leave what is not. So let's begin with a word for anyone who is feeling particularly pulled apart right now. This is a reading for ordinary time. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. Psalm 139:13. This is titled Abomination. Who has unraveled you? Who has snipped and ripped at your intricate strands until the very fibers of your being hang like cobwebs across the chasm between the lies you have been told and the truth of who you are? Who flipped loose the yarn? Who has dropped all these stitches? Who undid all my good work? Who hung you out to dry beneath the merciless heat of an oppressive sun until the vibrant brightness and the rich depths of the spectacular spectrum I gave you have faded and grayed into the muted pallor of an overwashed soul? Who stripped out the colors? Who has denied you the promise of my state of existing? Who slung the mud? Who wrote your name in dirt? Who infringed upon my trademark? Who has discarded you? Who has removed you from the honored place of display, slipping you farther and further back into the shadowed corners of the closet? Who discounted your worth? Who miscalculated your value? Who diminished my treasure? Who has done this abominable thing to my good and perfect creation? Show Mama who did this to you. I will sort them out.
Wow. Amen.
I hope this poem has been a word of affirmation for you, for who you are and for who you are coming to be. And I hope that it also gives you a sense of the content of my book. It is essentially a resource for ministry and for personal spiritual reflection. It contains a reading for every Sunday and feast day of Lectionary Year C, our current lectionary year. And it also has an index of scripture references and an index of themes for use outside of Year C. The themes include issues of class and race and ability, of sexual and gender diversity, of care for our environment, and care for our precious, holy souls. My book would not have been possible without my theological formation at Eden. The professors and my cohort broke me apart and held me together as I learned to approach the Bible with a critical lens that searches for the other and centers the marginalized. I hope that anyone who reads it will be strengthened and inspired in their own theological imagination. And I get it. We are the alum of the past 1 to 5 years, and for some of you, even more years than that. We have been sent out of Eden into the rocks and fields of our various forms of ministry where the struggle is real. This is a word for any of us who feel ground down by the daily toil of the work. A reading for the second Sunday of Easter, which is this coming Sunday. But Peter and the apostles answered, "We must obey God rather than any human authority." Acts 5:29. This is titled another scroll. The task of the faithful remains this. On those days when the tyrant has toasted his toes over the smoldering remains of papyrus, smudged with your own sweat and tears, and sent your amanuensis scrambling back to your side, bearing news of Jehoiakim's pride. On those days, take another scroll. In those years, when steel-clad conquistadors have crushed the muscles and bones of the enslaved with parchments emblazoned with official seals, and sent disease and famine among the people, bearing death and calling it life. In those years, take another scroll. In those times when the leader has legislated loathing and legitimized the loathsome with military uniforms and prescribed papers and stars and death squads and trains, bearing the bodies to the end of the line. In those times, take another scroll. On these days, when the puppet is plumping his pillow in golden chambers built on the backs of unpaid bills, where he tweets in the small hours to stir new flames from coals of hatred, to warm Stromboli's bed, while Geppetto weeps in blood-soaked streets. On this day, take another scroll. And I know that you know. You know how important our ministries are. Whether you have been called to the pulpit or to the hospital bed or to something less defined by our systems, you understand that the work you do is life-saving. Maybe you don't know it every day. In the mundane moments, in the frequent frustrations, but you know it in the crux of it, in those times when pain and beauty meet and spirit fuels you with the tender courage you need to face the moment. I commend you to that work. I commend us to that work. As we read in Hebrews 10:25, let us not neglect to meet together for encouragement, whether that is in person or online, in our brick and mortar structures or in the cathedral of nature. And thank you. Thank you for indulging me as I have shared from my work of the past 5 years. It feels especially holy to me to return here to celebrate this book in the place where it all began. And I'll finish now with a reading for the Ascension of Christ. When he had said this, as they were watching, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. Acts 1:9. This is titled, Do. Every now and then, less so now that my knees ache, I stroll up to that hilltop, broom in hand, and shoo away another group of cloud gazers. I tell them, as I'm telling you, the tomb was empty. So, what of it? Go and grab some bandages. There are still wounds that need tending. Get into trouble, the good kind of trouble, even when it sets you against your own kin. Get up and go and breathe in the face of hell so that no one can deny your proof of life. But don't lay around here all day looking up at the sky. There's just too much to do. Thank you.
So Doug started using this hashtag, Eden Leading. And we've picked up on it institutionally, and we've picked up on it in lots of ways. And Amy, Eden Leeden. I mean, I'm just looking around the table, and I'm looking on the Zoom screen, and just the pride that this school, this community of learning and faith can take in each of you, and in the ways that you're contributing to the church and the world. Just amazing. I do encourage you to stop by the bookstore on your way out, and if you would so like to purchase Amy's book, Another Scroll, it will help with your preaching ministries and your personal devotions in your ministry. We have recently reopened, and actually we're thinking about this moment as our grand reopening of the physical bookstore after it was on hiatus for some of the early phases of COVID. And so this is a chance for Amy's book. One of our hopes, Scott Hull is serving as our librarian and archivist and bookstore charge. And one of the hopes is to build out our alumni publications. And so I'm just wondering if around the table, is there anyone else who's done some publishing in particular that you could share with us? Not yet, okay. Well, lots of other ways that we are making and sharing our work, but wanted to open that space and also just to highlight the bookstore piece and Amy's continuing work. So thank you. Deb, you want to say something about Kirk's work, just to get us started? And Kirk, then you're going to be up with your PowerPoint.
I'll just say a few words of introduction, not take much time here, for our leader for this next section of our Herbster time. We're going to be led by Reverend Dr. Kirk Foster. Reverend, right? Yeah, that's what I thought. Reverend Dr. Kirk Foster. He is director and the Carolyn Fries Baines Distinguished and Associate Professor in the School of Social Work, College of Health and Human Performance of Eastern Carolina University. And Kirk is a 1994 graduate of Eden's 7? How did I get that wrong?
I started in '94.
Oh, okay. I had when we met and when you
That's
graduated
right.
and stuff.
Right.
1997 graduate of Eden Seminary, and he graduated with his MDiv, and shortly thereafter found his way to the Brown School of Social Work at Washington University, where he received his Master of Social Work. And while he was going through that process and soon thereafter falling in love with social work, and in particular social scientific research related to social work, he encouraged Eden and Eden's dean at the time, Jaretta Marshall, to be thinking about developing a joint degree program with the Brown School of Social Work, which continues to this day and has graduated many excellent joint degree candidates who are serving the community and the world in brilliant ways with their Eden and Brown School degrees. And so, Kirk, you really know how to get things started. And we're incredibly grateful for that innovation and leadership. And here, Kirk is in his capacity as a social scientific researcher and a social worker, a scholar of social work, been supporting Eden in our Phase 1 Lilly. The Lilly Endowment gave us some money to do an impact survey of you all and of the last 20 years of graduates. related particularly to their contextual ed experience and how that has empowered and impacted your ministries and your understanding of ministry. And so Kirk created a survey with Mary and Steve Waller and his own graduate student assistant, I believe, and they created a survey that many of you participated in. And so, Kirk, we're incredibly gratified by this connection, and obviously we've been encouraged and look forward to hearing some of the results of your research, and are just so grateful for your presence in this process. So thank you for being here today.
We're going to let you take it away, Kirk.
Great. Thanks for having me. And it's good to be back in the Eden community, even though I join you from Eastern North Carolina, where the beach is only a mere hour's drive away. And I'm not referring to the beach on the banks of the Mississippi River, where I grew up. One note that Deb did not share with you is that she preached my ordination service almost 25 years ago at Christ United Church of Christ in Tupelo, Illinois, just right across the river from downtown St. Louis. So it's been good, and I'm glad to be back with you all in this capacity and sharing with you at least some preliminary findings from this impact study as another way that we think about and engage with the church. So I will begin sharing my screen and then move into the presentation. I have not gained those COVID technology skills that so many other people gained. So bear with me, as hopefully it will not be wonky, but we will do this. Let's see. All right. So do you all see just my presentation, or do you see my notes as well?
Just your presentation.
Great. Then just completely forget my apologia about my technologies. So as Deb mentioned and Mary mentioned, this is part of Eden's effort to better understand the impact of the contextual education program as we, I say we collectively, as I have helped Eden think about this in their Lilly endowment grant process. So this piece of that work revolves around understanding the impact of contextual education on vocational resilience and adaptability in leadership capacities. That's a lot of words. And today, really what I want to do for you is just to introduce you to the purpose of this, only slightly admonish you if you did not participate after receiving the email, and go through some findings with you. At the end, we'll provide about 15 minutes where you can discuss one or both of the two questions that I have posed for you. So there you go. I completely already went over that. So the purpose of this impact evaluation is to understand the impact of Eden's contextual education program on resilience and adaptability in pursuit of one's vocation, and the extent to which contextual education builds lasting capacity to promote social, economic, and racial justice and racial equity in ministry contexts. That's a lofty goal, and I believe we have some important data to share around that. Just to give you a sense of who participated in the study and who was eligible to participate. We targeted MDiv graduates who matriculated through the through Eden's program during the period of 2000 to 2020. This is approximately 523 people, and recruitment relied on the on Eden's database of active email addresses from graduates during this period, and that was about 288 people. So again, you may have received an email from Deb or one of Eden's development officers notifying you of the study, and you may or may not have completed the survey. Approximately 37% of folks of that 288 did complete the survey, but only 65 of those, who signed on and provided some data actually completed the survey and provided us with usable data. So that's about 22.6% of the 288 people. It's a little less than we would like. So, hey, if you want to complete the survey and you didn't do it, just let someone know. So a little about just a brief profile of who completed the survey. So most of those who completed the survey currently serve in congregational settings. That's roughly 73%. And of those, 66% serve in United Church of Christ congregations, and 9.2% serve in United Methodist churches, as well as another 9.2% in Disciples of Christ congregations. And I was not really surprised by that breakdown, given the population that Eden serves. So considering the 73% of those who responded that they're currently working in local congregations, nearly 72% of those are in white congregations, and nearly just over 72% are also in the Midwest. Most of the congregations have fewer than 100 active members, so just under 50%. Again, these numbers are in line with other national surveys of local churches. Now, in this sample, it is evenly split between rural congregations and suburban congregations, with just over 25% representing each one of those. It's also important to note, and I found interesting, that that 27% of all respondents to this survey, to our request to better understand the impact of Eden's contextual education program on our ministries, just over 20% worked in settings other than congregations or faith-based organizations or other nonprofit organizations. So this is a long catchment period of 21 graduation cycles, and only 2 graduation years were not represented in the sample. It was 2007 and 2013. I didn't notice any discernible trends by graduation year as to who, whether or not any year responded in greater numbers or more significant numbers than any other years. I also want to note that 10% of those who completed the study indicated that their ministry setting is primarily social justice oriented. And this speaks to, I believe, Eden's ongoing and increased commitment to social justice, racial justice, and racial equity over the past several years, particularly around contextual education. So we begin to get into the meat of the matter, and I'll report out some findings from various questions and various scales, and hopefully this makes sense to you. I remember when I started as associate pastor at Emmanuel United Church of Christ in Ferguson, Missouri, back in 1997, we had we had, I think it was called Church Windows, and it was basically a management information system, and I was constantly pulling data down from that database to figure out who was attending, when they were attending, what kinds of programs they were attending, because at that time we tried to keep some of those records. And so this has always been in my nature to to look at data in these kinds of ways to make some sense of how we do the work of ministry, and how we can be most effective by that. So you'll see as we move through, we'll talk about social justice and racial equity. We'll talk about adaptability, vulnerability, resilience, and some other things. Some of those are scaled items, if that makes any sense to you. So taking a number of questions and mashing them up in a statistical kind of way, and then doing analysis on those. And some, like this one, are single item questions. And so we asked everyone to what extent building racial equity is part of my daily work. And so it was on a scale from 1, strongly disagree, and 7 to strongly agree. And that's important to note, because you'll see in all of these upcoming tables that I've made these dichotomous, meaning it's either you agree or disagree. Part of that was because the data were so concentrated for the most part on the agree end. It made much more conceptual sense to lump them into agree and disagree, rather than to try and disaggregate the difference between the 2 people that said somewhat disagree and the 1 person that said disagree, and the like. And so you'll see in these tables, they are dichotomous items. So we asked this question about, as part of your daily work, do you work to build racial equity? And as you can see, so I've broken this down by congregation, by organization. And so that's this lump, this big lump category of those who may be doing chaplaincy work, those who may be serving in other types of faith-based organizations or nonprofit organizations, higher education, and the like. Those are all clumped into the organization category. Or respondents had the opportunity to say that they were working in both congregational setting and an organizational setting. And so again, you'll see that go throughout. The other important thing to note, and again, this carries through all of the tables, is that the percentages that you see here and in the upcoming slides are within that category. So it's not a percent of everyone, it's a percent of those people who identified their current ministry setting as in the congregation, those who identified their ministry setting as in an organization, or those who said they are serving both a congregation and an organization. So don't be like one of my students and raise your hand and say, Dr. Foster, those percentages don't add up to 100%. They'll add up to 300%. So as you can see here, certainly across the board, everyone agrees that building racial equity is part of their daily work. We see more within the local church that, roughly a third of local church pastors who are represented in this sample said that it is not part of their daily work. But by and large, everyone views building racial equity as part of their daily work. So this is a slightly different question. It is again a 1-item question that we asked. How much or to what extent do you agree with the statement that challenging systems of oppression is part of my daily work? And here we see no difference in the way that those serving faith-based or other nonprofit organizations think about their daily work with respect to racial equity and oppression. However, those graduates only serving local churches see themselves more in the space of challenging systems of oppression and building racial equity. As you recall, in the previous slide, it was just under 69% agreed with the statement that building racial equity is part of their daily work. Whereas here, challenging just over 82% of those serving local churches agree that challenging systems of oppression is part of their daily work. So I do think that's notable, and how we think about, or how graduates of the MDiv program out there serving in various types of ministry settings are thinking about or differentiating racial equity and racial justice work from challenging the work of challenging systems of oppression. So we do see. Let me also say this. We don't see any notable differences in the distribution of responses across graduation years. So again, one of the things that we were looking for in this study was, as Eden began to make this shift, and if you think about the work that Eden has done around incorporating racial justice, racial equity, and anti-oppression, anti-racism within its curriculum and within its contextual education as an arc, we didn't see any notable differences in the distribution of those responses across those graduation years. And so that's just to say, it does not appear likely that these orientations are a function of when one graduated from Eden with their MDiv. There is no statistically significant association between these orientations with graduation year or with the age of the respondent. So again, I find it interesting, and I haven't quite, I'm not quite sure what to make of it, and that's something that we'll have a greater conversation about with the folks at Eden. Continuing with this notion of social justice and racial equity, we created a diversity practice scale, which included 5 individual questions that we aggregated together and then took the mean of to keep it on the original 1 to 7 scale. But again, similarly to other individual questions, the scale behaved the same way because, well, the individual questions make up the scale. And so we then made that dichotomous into an agree or disagree. So some of the questions in this diversity practice scale, they all revolve around contextual education. How did contextual education prepare me for changing racial and ethnic patterns, changing patterns of congregational leadership? I'm invited by changing in racial ethnic patterns. How did contextual education shape my ongoing spiritual formation with communities and congregations of racial and ethnic diversity? How did it shape my ongoing vocational formation with these communities? And how did contextual education shape my ongoing engagement in the work of social justice with communities and congregations of racial and ethnic diversity? So all of these questions centered around preparing one for ministry within changing communities and changing systems. So here what we see is that among those serving congregation, it's nearly split as to whether folks agree or disagree that contextual education actually prepared them for working in these communities of changing racial and ethnic composition. Again, we see that those serving organizations felt better equipped, and then also those serving both felt better equipped, only slightly, than those in congregations. What I can say is that there is statistical significance here between graduation year and diversity practice, so this diversity practice scale. So for each 1 year increase in graduation year, we experience a unit increase in diversity, or 0.1 unit increase in diversity practice. It's not a very robust finding. The model only explains about 11% of the variance between these variables, but it's still something to consider as we begin, as we analyze how, how this material, how these experiences, how this emphasis and this ethos was integrated into contextual education over time. My apologies to that. I get a little nerdy on you with the statistics, but that is that is an important statistical finding. So again, and what we see, what we see here is again looking at how contextual education prepared me for changing racial and ethnic patterns using this scale item again. But this time we look at it, this last time, so I just flipped back to the previous slide. In this analysis, we looked at that contextual ed preparation with respect to the current ministry setting. Here, we look at it with respect to the racial composition of the contextual education site. So did the racial composition of the site where a respondent indicated they spent their time in contextual ed have any impact at all on their diversity practice? And so you can see here that among those whose contextual ed were in mostly white congregations, or mostly white settings, it did not help, or it did not assist with preparing them for changing for ministry and changing racial and ethnic times. That intuitively should not surprise any of us, and neither should this next one, that those who were serving in mostly Black or African American settings did feel better prepared. And again, those in mixed settings also felt more prepared. Now, there was no statistically significant association between racial composition and diversity practice. We're not talking about any statistically significant finding, but as I often tell my students, we have to think about practical significance as well. And so again, while these findings are intuitive, they do confirm what we might assume would be the case. This table here, in comparison to the last one, looks at the racial composition of the current site with respect to the diversity practice. This contextual education preparing me for diversity practice. And so again, here, if you are in a mostly white congregation or a mostly white setting, you're split. If you are in a mostly Black or African American setting currently, again, it's about 2/3, 1/3. And interestingly here, with respect to the current composition site, we see that there's been a little shift in the numbers between if you're serving in a mixed racial setting. So with about 11.5% more agreeing than disagreeing. All right, excuse me. So we also asked, and we're curious about how contextual education prepared MDiv graduates for changing patterns, and how ready one might be to address matters related to changing patterns of racial and ethnic composition in their ministry setting. And so I created a readiness for change scale of the following questions. Contextual education prepared me for changing patterns of ministry of my community and congregation. And likewise, contextual education prepared me to lead in the changing patterns of congregational organizational leadership. Again, there's no statistical significant association between current ministry setting and the readiness for change. But we can see here among those serving congregations, it's near, it is about 70% agreed that that contextual ed prepared them to lead effectively in these times of change, and just like 70, again, almost 73% among organizations and 80% among those serving both. So by and large, what we see here is that MDiv graduates did feel or did respond that they felt that their contextual ed site prepared them for leadership within these changing times. So how do we think about this, or how does the racial composition of the contextual ed site, and then you'll see in the next slide, the current ministry setting, relate to, or how do people in these various categories think about their own preparedness for change? Again, no statistically significant association here. Among those serving in congregations, we see that over 63%, so again, this is nearly a 2/3, 1/3 split. So if you look down that agree column, all individuals, regardless of the racial composition of their contextual education site, do agree that contextual ed prepared them for leadership within these changing racial and ethnic communities. So, I jumped ahead of myself. Yeah, we're good. So, and I'm almost right on time. Yay. Resilience. We were interested in resilience because we know that burnout is high. We know that developing patterns of resilience early on can certainly be a protective factor against burnout. What we see here is that most participants do something every day that expresses vocational resilience and adaptability. And so this sample clearly has found, those who responded to this have clearly found meaning in their work, which we would define as a resilient population, considering that the meaning-making process is a protective factor against burnout. And so this was a scale. We created a resilience scale of 4 questions. I understand the meaning of the ministry work in my life. My life and ministry is a clear sense of purpose. I have a good sense of what makes my ministry work meaningful, and I've discovered a satisfying purpose in my ministry work. And so what we see here is that, yes, based on even when we look at, when we break it out into one's current ministry setting, everyone overwhelmingly responded positively to those statements. So I was very excited to see that. We created an adaptability. We created also an adaptability scale. But let me go back. I'm focusing too much on time, and I forgot what I wanted. One thing I wanted to say here. I also created, and I'm not sharing with you today, the flip side of resilience, the corollary, which is vulnerability. And I was curious, so within the larger scale that I drew the resilience questions out of, there were also questions embedded in there that would get at vulnerability, how vulnerable one was to not finding purpose, to burnout and the like. And sometimes what can happen is, when we use scales like this, we can see, strong response like we do on the slide in front of you, that yes, this is a resilient population, but at the same time, we can also see that folks are expressing some levels of vulnerability. And the reason I didn't put it up here to share with you today is because those responses were very low, and which is good, which helps us to demonstrate that there's not a lot of wonkiness in the data, and that indeed I feel confident in making the statement that that this sample is does express a lot of resilience. And so this is my last data slide, I promise, and I threw some notations at you if you're
You triggered some of us.
I did, I'm sorry. I'm like, right? And I didn't know what the laughter was about because I had to have you all minimized so I could see my notes. So I just had to open you back up, which is all right. So this is the last data slide, and miraculously, I'm only 3 minutes over my talking time. So here we used a scale, the Campbell and Stein adaptability scale. It's a 10-item scale. I won't read them all to you, but essentially I'm able to adapt to change. I can deal with problems. I think of myself as a strong person. I can handle unusual or unpleasant situations and the like. And so what we see here is that the mean response on the adaptability scale is 5.8. So if you think about this scale of being from 1 to 7, right, with 1 to 3 being some form of disagreement, 4 being I don't know, and 5 through 7 being some sort of agreement, this falls kind of in the middle of somewhat agree. So we're not so the respondents weren't overly confident in their ability to adapt, but they were confident enough that it falls onto the agree side. It didn't make it because the majority of the responses fell on the agree side. It did not make sense to create a dichotomous variable out of this to show you one of those other nice tables that I had earlier. And so so that's the 5.8. The second one is the mean of contextual education prepared me for changing patterns of ministry. And so this is back to a 1-item question, just to compare the two, compare this 1-item question asking specifically about how respondents believed contextual education prepared them for changing patterns as compared to this larger this 10-item adaptability scale. So again, you can see here that even on that 1 item, respondents are at 4.9. So right at the very top of that, I don't know, and the bottom of the somewhat agree. And so we can say that what we could say from this, or what we know, or what we see in this, is that this is a place for the contextual education program to grow. That it is not that there is a very weak link, or that graduates don't feel as strongly about their ability to adapt to changing contexts as they might some other factors that we surveyed. All right, so Mary, and I guess Mary, we have a little bit of time for breakout groups. I don't know if you want to switch into those, if you want to allow anyone to ask me any questions. I'm not quite sure how you want to navigate this next step. There are 2 questions on the screen for breakout conversations. It's up to you all.
Right, so we got started a little bit late, and so we want to honor time that you all have set aside. So anyone who is off to another project, feel free to do that. We are a relatively small group also, so my suggestion is that for the next 10 minutes that we be one breakout group in this space. And so what this is an opportunity for us to do is to continue in narrative form the way that we've been seeing these statistics. And part of the hope of the curriculum is that we will continue to build in practices of assessment, of impact study. And Kirk, I was, when you started, you said in your first pastorate that you had a lot of data and you were analyzing data and you paid attention to that, and that has shaped your vocation right now. I think that's probably a good thing for all of us to pay attention to. What is it in our ministry settings that really gives us life and energy? And pay attention to that and how that shapes where we might be going. So those of you who are taking off, we are able to pay your mileage if you came from further than Duhan Hall, as I'm looking at Karen. So Sandy can take care of you with the paperwork needed for us to be able to have that, and so very grateful.
Yeah, I would just say, just see me before you leave and then I'll take it.
And so, we're just gonna have a short conversation. Kirk, if you want to put your points back out. I wonder if vocational adaptability and resilience. Just open that up to those of us who are here. What does that look like?
For me, I would say, in my settings, I serve 2 small rural churches, 2 towns under 600. Politically divided, Southern Illinois is pretty, you kind of know where Southern Illinois is politically. Having been through school here, I'm not necessarily there anymore. I might have been at one time in my life, but I've moved. And so, I try to find ways to engage in these topics and conversations with folks in ways that are non-threatening. But I also need to have outlets where I can just express myself. And so I have at least one, if not more, friends that I can have conversation with and just discuss whatever comes to mind without worrying about who might take offense and whose toes I'm stepping on and which political party I might be offending, if not both or three, all of them. So I think that really is a skill that I've learned through being here. Whether it was in vocational, in my contextual ed, where you're dealing with people in the community and you don't necessarily know where they're coming from. I especially appreciated the self-care class that I took over at J-Term. That was very helpful. Just knowing you have permission to take care of yourself and not everybody else all the time, that's really helpful. So, just learning that you can learn, change, adapt.
So we're going to stay on this vocation and adaptability. And Kirk, if you want to take your slide down, then we'll be able to see each other more. So if you stop your screen share. There we go. Now we can see who's all on Zoom too. Thank you, Dee, for asking for that. Others on what does vocational resilience look like?
It's kind of like, what are your joys and concerns this morning?
After a long day of a lot of
a place of humility, that God is God and we are not, I think is a good starting point, because, I mean, it's the quote in the hallway there, Niebuhr, but all of it just like nothing worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime, right? Or in Kingdom Entrepreneurs, Prophets of a Future, it's like it helps every now and then take a step back and look at the long arc of things. And so we can't change it. And for me, with this survey, I think I read it wrong. Because when I read about like how often do you think, not about the times changing, but you changing the times, right? And so I saw it in a much more maybe aggressive way. Like, are you facilitating the change? Are you the one actually creating the change, right? Rather than the times are changing and are you adapting to them? I kind of saw it in a different light. And so there's this conversation about like when things change, as all things do, how do we continue to ground ourselves in the communities that we find ourselves, love authentically, and recognize the fact that even our best attempts at times won't always produce the end results we want. And there is a, as the poem goes on from Kenneth, there is both like simultaneously, like there is a kind of fear and a shame that we can't do everything we want to do, but then there is also a freedom of knowing that just because we cannot do everything doesn't mean we can't do something, and to do it very well. And so by limiting our scope of what we can do well, we can do work worth doing.
Yeah, so Kirk, how do you hear that when you probably run into this all the time with people interpreting questions in different ways?
Yeah, I mean, so what I always tell my students when when we're talking about survey design, you can't control how someone experiences a question or experiences a survey, and you have to take the data on face value. There are some things that we can do scientifically ahead of time, which we did some of those prior to rolling this out, to better understand how questions might be perceived. And we do things like standardized definitions and such. But yeah, I mean, we all approach surveys, we approach life, we approach our ministry through our own experiences, through our own hermeneutic lenses. And it is through those lenses that we will respond to surveys, and we will think about what it means to be part of anti-oppressive, anti-racist practices, ministry practices. And so, yeah, I mean, so the short answer, Mary, is it is what it is, and humans are humans, and we're complex. And what we do in social science is we try and deal with those complexities through statistical methods.
You know, reflecting on what Nick just shared, and you're thinking about that, how it's interpretable. Nick, what was your graduating year?
16.
So 2016, Nick graduated from Eden. So his entire time here was consumed with Ferguson. His entire, I mean, and the seminary's response to that. And I wonder if there isn't a certain way of reading that question among graduates who were in that particularly intense frame, where we were all feeling the call, to change these systems. I mean, not that we didn't before and don't now, but that your educational formation was in seminary, was in that pressure cooker, that may have, guided that sense of that response. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting.
And I mean, you also were in the, since graduation, right? There've been, technically since that 16, right?
Exactly.
We're in the third presidency.
Right.
In the middle of the third year of the pandemic.
Right.
There's also, you want to talk about, variety of things happening, but that's every stage of life. We were talking last night about the 50th anniversary, of Class of 72, when you think about people who came just before with all the social change there, and war, and there's so many different factors that are always, but this has also been, I've heard this since before I attended Eton, that there is an optimism of, you leave seminary wanting to change the world and you struggle to change a bulletin. Right, and so there is a tension within the lived reality of how do we actually affect change, and so a lot of times this is where resiliency and vulnerability comes into factor, because we have to recognize the fact that we're not going to be able to change everything in these monumental sweeping ways as if we can have, we can walk into a china shop in the back and just shake everything up. There is the long work of building relationships, and it takes time, and it is like water over granite. Like, you can shape the course of the river over time, but it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of persistence.
I would like to share.
It does take a lot of time and it takes a lot of resistance, but in that, seminary, I feel, has helped me prepare myself to be part of the change that I hope to see in this world. It's taking me into that path.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the difference between, do we want to simply be spectators in the changing world, or do we actually want to be part of the change?
We have to be a participant.
Yeah.
We have to be a participant of the change.
Dee, you were
And
going to say something.
I completed seminary during the time of pre-pandemic,
Right.
but we were still struggling through first
Yep.
the legal problems and all of that, and the uprising in other cities as a result of first, while I was
Yep.
part of
That's right, huh?
what we were doing here at Eden. Yeah, I graduated in 2020. So it's a work in progress, to say the least. But in our ministry, in our church, a lot of our congregants struggle with what's going on with the pandemic, and really trying to reherd them back into, come on back to church. It's going to be okay. You'll be able to breathe. They struggle with that, with the results of what's been going on with the pandemic.
I think, Dee, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I would like to share how Eden developed a resilience for ministry, and probably didn't even know you were doing it. Our contextual placement, we were 4 UU students with 2 churches in the St. Louis area. And so we proposed a collaborative internship via Zoom, because it was the pandemic, with 4 Unitarian churches. And we are forever grateful to 2 of our supervisors, one of which was Amy Brooks, who gave her time as our helping us with the logistics. And in that collaborative internship done mainly by Zoom, when we did sermons, all 4 of us did part of the sermon. When we did religious education classes, all 4 of us did an adult religious education class. Then we graduated. But that was such a transformative experience. We didn't all graduate, 2 of us graduated. That was such a transformative experience that we have continued that collaboration. And as we talked about, some of us, their final year of seminary, and some of us in internships, we have come together and helped each other in such a way that we could go forward, so that when we got into congregations and they weren't moving as fast as we wanted them to move, we could help each other and say, you have to be a little bit careful, you have to be patient, but you can do it. And that, we are so grateful, the 4 of us, to Eden for you letting us do that collaborative internship. And we all wish, and I can't in this point speak for the others, we all wish you would encourage more of that, because it developed what will be a lifelong bond that will help us through our ministry.
That's right. Well, y'all, we have this recording. What great contributions to this continuing assessment and evaluation and the impact, and as you all have said, we don't even know it at the time. So we're going to draw this to a conclusion. Thank you all for participating, for being here. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Kirk. And we send you out to be safe, to be impactful, to be faithful. Go in peace.
Thank you. Thanks for
Thank
coming,
you.
everyone. Thanks for coming.
Should we also send them out with an extra box?
And with extra box.